Great.
So this is my cognitive map, which leads me and necessarily then you as well through my talk. I will briefly talk about specific challenges to democracy, will present some empirical data on the erosion of democracy, and then this is the core of the presentation, try to define and to conceptualize democratic resilience as an analytical frame, but also as an normative orientation for public interventions. So I try somehow opulent to combine structure, functions, and actors. And then the normative, a kind of normative question or practical question, how can we strengthen democratic resilience in our time? So does not move. So these are the challenges I already mentioned. I distinguish between external and internal challenges to liberal democracy. If I'm talking here this evening on democracy, I have always in mind talking about liberal democracy. There are, of course, the economic challenges, inequality. We have seen, or we are still in a pandemic which changes, according to my point of view, changes some of the internal substance of democracy, and we are amidst and will be confronted in the future with a quite dramatic climate crisis. There are internal challenges. This is, of course, right-wing populism. I will not talk about this. I will more focus, so to say, on a kind of our own political camp. I will talk about illiberal reactions of liberal democracy in the front of what I call new crisis of the 21st century. And I mention here at least 2 or 3: pandemic, climate change, and migration. What I'm observing, especially in Europe, and you might come in with your experience as well, there is, in times of acute crisis, a clear shift from input to output legitimacy. And the people like it, or at least the majority focus more on the results of decision making, but not on input or throughput of these decision makings. What has been the case in Germany, but in other West European countries as well, parliaments were to some extent, at least in certain periods, marginalized by a strong executive. And then I will put my finger on a development, what I call scientification of politics and policy making. And at the same time, somehow paradoxically, moralization of these scientific observations. So moralization, I will later on say a word, what I mean by moralization, and then what we clearly can pin down with empirical data. There is polarization going on in most of the developed liberal democracies. This is just what you know. This is the mainstream opinion on the state of democracy now for almost 10 years. And I tried to find these kind of books in 5 or 6 different European languages, and there is no problem to fill these slides with titles which diagnose or predict how democracies die, from Danny Seeblatt and Levitsky, Democracy in Decline, Losing Control, The End of Democracy, and so forth. So I just realized at this moment the book of our good friend John Keane, Life and Death of Democracy, is even not portrayed here. And I have edited a book with my team at the Berlin Science Center, and we called it Democracy and Crisis, and not of crisis. I will not go into detail why I refuse to some extent to call what is going on a crisis of democracy, because we are not very good in defining when such a crisis starts, when it ends, and in a way we are talking in modern times since the beginning of the 1970s with the writings of Jürgen Habermas, Klaus Offe, Jim O'Connor, and others about a democracy in crisis. But if there is a permanent crisis of democracy, then I do think this is a kind of paradoxical misnomer. So I avoid the term crisis here. I prefer for the moment erosion of democracy. Here you see the EU countries, Australia, Canada, the US, Japan, and New Zealand. And you see an upward trend in the quality of democracy, with a brief stop with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, then up to the year 2008. And then we see a clear, or let's say a significant statistical decline of the most liberal developed democracies we know. And I was just looking to 4 countries. Oh, I have to apologize. I had a slide with Australia as well. And Australia had, just to explain that or describe that, Australia had more or less, like Germany, a decline in the quality of democracy. I'm using here the VDEM data, Varieties of Democracy, the Liberal Democracy Index. Except from the best performer, according to these data, Denmark, you have for more or less all of these 29 or 30 democracies, you have a significant statistical erosion and decline in the quality of democracy. Here is Australia. Sorry, and this is the line of Australia. There is a peak which you probably can better explain than I do. And here you have a decline in the quality of democracy as well. I was disaggregating these data to some extent in a first step, and then you see where you have a significant decline within the fabric, within the structures of democracy. This is clear, an increase in political violence. There is what they call, it's still aggregated, freedom of expression, especially in harassment of journalists, and stronger influence by governments into the especially analog newspapers and television stations. There is an increasing media bias across these countries. A moderate decline you see in the restriction of individual rights. The independence of courts is declining, and also all these exercises to enhance the equality before the law was more or less stopped during this time. If it comes to elections and gender relations, for example, they don't observe any decline in the quality of democracy. Let's come to the point, what do we mean with democratic resilience? If there is an erosion of democracy, and we would argue our liberal democracies do not have resources of resilience, then we might slip into a crisis of democracy, however we define it. Looking to the literature, then we see that resilience is becoming or has become a core concept in many different disciplines of science, in physics, in material physics, in health research, in engineering, in sociology, psychology especially. And it's beginning now that political science tries to define such a concept for their purposes as well. First, somehow lean, trying to define it, resilience in a lean way. Then one can say resilience is the ability of a system, and now it comes to absorb, to withstand, or recover from stress and disturbances without undergoing a regime change, meaning these systems have to maintain their definitional structures and functions, so their core structure and functions, so we do not see a regime change or a regime transition. That's the first attempt to define resilience. Here we are talking about a specific type of resilience, meaning democratic resilience. As I already have pointed out, the concept has mostly a twofold meaning. It is a descriptive term or an analytical term, but it can also give some normative orientation for public intervention into politics and policy making. The functionalist parts, here I repeated because I do think there are important differences between the three: to withstand, to react, and to recover after initial damage. Very often you don't find the dimension or the function or the possible reaction of a regime or a system to recover. You don't find, but I do think we have to go deeper into recovering after some intensive stresses is quite important. Think about, for example, Brazil, what will happen after Bolsonaro, or if think about Orban's Hungary, how do they recover? Do they recover? Can they mobilize resources and sources of resilience? I use these functions as a kind of building block for a usable concept of democratic resilience. And here is the attempt to bring together structure and functions. On the right side, you see here the functions of democratic resilience. Again, withstand, react, recover. From as external stressors, you see examples, certainly prime examples of typical stress: economic stress, climate stress, migration stress, and pandemic stress. And they hit not only the democratic system as a whole, but I try to differentiate the democratic system on 4 fundamental levels. These first are the constitutional powers. The second are the most important political actors, political parties. And the third one is civil society. I distinguish civil society from civic culture, which is a sample of civic attitudes, and civil society is more the society which is able to act collectively. And here you have the political community. This is what, for example, David Easton always stressed very much in his early concept of political systems. This is, so to say, the society which has a self-understanding of belonging to each other, though it's a political community. And the idea is, if there is an erosion of the most fundamental base of democracy, the political community, there might, and here the arrows should also go upward, there might be then a situation for democracy which can be risky. So this is what allows us then to think about on these 4 levels, what is in disbalance and what has to be rebalanced. And here I have, to some extent, the most recent highly traumatic crises as climate change and the pandemic in mind, to some extent reactions to migrations as well. Just a word on migration. I don't think this is necessarily a stress to societies, but the reaction very often creates stress and cleavages in the reaction to migration, to immigration, creates turmoil and cleavages in many societies. So rebalancing the executive-legislative relation after 18 months or even longer of COVID-19 means that the legislative side has to be strengthened after the executive. It has been called in kind of Schmidtian terms in Europe, this is the hour of the executive. And it has been, to some extent, the hour of the executive. And if you look, for example, to Germany, there was no strong parliamentary opposition because the most important oppositional party, the Greens, argue this is not the time of opposition, this is the time of responsibility. But I have the firm convictions, time of responsibility for parliaments is also the, or for the opposition in parliament, is that they remain opposition. They control the executive. they provide alternative proposals for bills and so forth. The strongest part, as far as I can see, was during this time and still is. There are quite interesting ruling by the German Constitutional Court, most recently on climate change, binding the government to quite an extent to accelerate anti-climate crisis measures. So but during the pandemic, administrative courts, more than the constitutional court, were checking and to some extent restricting executive measures, and this happened especially on the level of the single states 100 times. 100 times they overruled executive decisions. So you see, it's not a minor attack on a balance of constitutional power. Of course, if I am in Canberra, but not only, when I'm in Canberra, I have to argue this is not the only thing. We have to open more deliberative spaces and arenas. By the way, I change step by step my mind and be more and more open to these, as a hardcore institutionalist, to these deliberative arenas. We just finished for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation a study on citizen assemblies and citizen councils. What I do think it's quite important, and this is our observation, input and throughput decision making was not that important, not only among the political elites. The population, the citizen expected there must be the right, whatever it is, the right output, and if there is the right output, input and throughput measures and procedures are not so important. If it comes to attacks or to the party system, and if we think about how to make these political parties and party systems more resilient, I do think we have to isolate hardcore anti-system parties. I have to say I don't consider all right-wing populist parties as anti-system parties in terms of Giovanni Sartori. Many of them are, in terms of Yuan Lin's, semi-loyal parties. And these you can convince, you should include, because there is a strong tendencies in many Western liberal society to exclude those who they consider as illiberal enemies. So no freedom for the enemy of freedom is the slogan you hear quite often, even now in Parliament, where they accepted a bill spending more than 1 billion euros for strengthening civil society and initiatives against the hardcore right. If it comes to the third level, civic culture and civil society, I'm not very in favor of these highly quantitative approaches as we have seen in the Johns Hopkins project, just counting civil organization. We should look in times where we see an increasing polarization and fragmentation and singularization of our societies. We have to think about how to bridge these cleavages in society. So a lot of energy and creativity has to be brought in order to think about producing, bridging social capital and not so much bonding social capital. The last one I was already talking about, we are living in times of highly diverse societies with many advantages which comes with the diversity. But on the other side, we are living also as a reaction in times of identity politics. Identity politics from the right side, of course, in terms of nationalism, but also liberal identity politics, as Mark Lilla and others pointed out. So there is a danger of deepening rifts and cleavages running through our societies, hollowing out from the inside the political community, and to quote Juan Linz again, without a political community, democracy cannot exist. So as from a more social point of view, governments have to invest more into equal life chances of the people. And despite all these identity cleavages, the socioeconomic cleavage has not been bridged through all these decades after the Second World War. What we will see in the climate crisis, and we already saw in the pandemic, there was no fair burden sharing. And that great transformation which might be necessary for our societies in order to fight climate change means also we have to find a fair burden sharing, because at the beginning, and this is what we have learned from many crises, at the beginning there will be an unequal distribution of burdens, and it's mostly the lower third or the lower half of the society, let's say the lower half of the society, who carries most of the burden. I think I have two more slides here. This should be moved somehow more upwards in my presentation, but polarization I was talking about, this is not simply an invention by an observer. Here again, we have data from VDEM, which clearly show that through during the last 2 decades, we have in many countries, not in all, we have in many countries a steep increase in polarization of the society, including here not only Poland and Hungary, but also very much, as we know, the United States of America, and here during the last time, to some extent, the beginning of the migration inflow of many people, we have an increase of polarization in our society as well. And to Felix, Denmark, in Denmark, they observe no increase at all in polarization. So, conclusion, to sum it up, there is a major attack against our democracy from illiberal forces, but to some extent, I'm even more concerned about how liberal forces, liberal parties, especially left liberal parties, and I think I'm belong to this camp. You see illiberal reaction to people, to exclude from parliament, to ban from society. And a very strange thing is happening. I by myself was in the 1970s very much involved in the student movements, and we were observed by the internal secret service, Verfassungsschutz. And they even refused to accept me in a position as research assistant at the Institute of Sports in Heidelberg, because I was involved and they had files on these activities. And now you see the left liberal camps, especially in Germany, where I really can see it, which are opting, and they are arguing for strong civil secret service observation of these right-wing movements. And I'm quite skeptical about this. The second one we will see in not only we have seen it in the pandemic, we will see it in the crisis of climate change as well. Safety, the trade-off between safety and freedom, and there was in most of the European societies an inclination to accept a strong reduction, at least for parts of the population, of liberal and individual rights, in the hope there will be more safety, though they are well prepared to give up freedom for safety, and this might be a problematic perspective for our societies as well. Again, we have to build bridges between nationalists and supranationalists, or as we called it in a project at the Berlin Science Center, between cosmopolitans and communitarians and nationalists. We have to come to grips in diverse communities and to learn that we are not only coexisting, but we are building a political and social community. And we have to look, in order to make our democracies more resilient, not only on these 4 levels, we have to look at the concrete substance of laws which distribute the burdens more equally across the society. And even as I already have said, as a kind of institutionalist, I do think in this moment, civil society actors are very important, because they can be guardians of freedom, of liberty, and of a just organization of our society. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm curious about your questions.